I'm going to invite you to come a little closer to the center, right here. So I'm going to wait a few moments, and if you're not in the center here, we'll give you a few moments to shift over. Thanks a lot. Just makes it easier to have a chat. I probably don't need this, but we will just turn it down a little bit. There we go. We just keep this on because we're recording, so we need to record our sermons, especially for those who are away at retreat. But we have come to a place now where we've been traveling through the entire Bible, and we're talking about hermeneutics, which is how do we understand and interpret the Bible. Not merely saying exegetically, which is the other discipline, exegesis, is understanding what the Bible actually is trying to say. Because after you understand what it says through exegesis, we do the discipline of hermeneutics, which is a fancy word for, well, what do we do with what we know, with what the Bible is saying? And we've been traveling through the Bible from the Genesis, and we ended up with wisdom literature. We wound up doing all the way through to the Song of Songs, and Pastor Diana last week did the intertestamental period to help us understand the deuterocanonical, or what we call the Apocrypha as Protestants, the material that sort of explains what happens between Malachi and the book of Matthew. But these are the evangelists. These are the four evangelists. These are the Gospels. And my task today is to let you understand and situate the importance of the Gospels and how we begin to read them. In the following weeks, we'll be breaking down each of the Gospels a little more for us to explore and understand. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first three books of the New Testament. But let's look a little bit deeper into this. And the question I want to ask is, why write? What's the last thing you wrote with your own hand? Does anyone remember? What's the last thing you wrote with your own hand? What's that? A journal? Yeah, you wrote in your journal? Fantastic. Anyone else? Well, I'm sorry, notes? Like in a meeting? In the notebook. All right.
My signature.
Your signature. Was it on a check or something? Or?
Yeah.
It was. Yeah, okay. Anything else? Okay, what about not just by your hand then? Even electronically, what was the last thing that you wrote? Email. Okay. Anyone else wrote email as the last thing that they did? How many texted? Okay, here's the question now. What did you text? What did you email? Or what did you write? I mean, if you're comfortable sharing it, it's like, something really super private. I'm sorry?
Okay.
My last is okay. You're responding to someone. I'm sorry, yours was?
Replying to someone.
Replying to someone? Okay. Anything else? Your reminder to yourself. Fantastic. Yeah. So a lot of times what we're doing is we're communicating something. The last written message I wrote was actually to my wife, because she's off at this retreat too. And so I put a bunch of notes together and I stuffed it in her, yeah, cute. Yeah, A+. The last thing I texted was this morning was again a response, arranging rides for Jenilyn as she goes off to play Ultimate. So we have to make sure all the rides were lining up. So it's communication. But what's important when we think about writing is, why do we write? What is its importance? Some people mention journaling, which is, I'm not sure what our understanding of journaling or diary writing is, but it's a reflection. It's an opportunity to reflect on something. And the process of writing, especially by hand, slows you down. That's what I've always discovered. Because if you type, you can actually go a lot faster if you know how to type, unless you're like one of these typers. Then it's not the same, and it can be just as meditative as writing, perhaps. Others, we're writing notes to remember, notes to yourself to remember things. And the other aspect is to communicate. Whether it's saying okay or response to someone, you're actually in these forms. So what we're talking about is what we want to begin with as we look at the Gospels is why Gospels. And it has to do with something, an invention of humanity that is very significant and important. And that is literacy. Before we were literate, before history, the whole idea of history is the ability to write down what has happened. Before that, everything is an oral tradition. And do understand that much of the Bible is based on oral tradition as well, before it was written down. Whether it's Old Testament ideas and concepts, as well as the Gospels themselves. People told each other stories about what happened. And so the communication was done orally. Now, what is the problem with oral transmission of information? One of them is that you can forget it. So in certain oral traditions, it comes across as songs. Some of our earliest songs were sung simply because they allowed us to remember. So you know how you'd be walking around and suddenly you hear a tune, and you know this song because you've heard it like a million times somewhere, maybe at the mall or in the elevator or at home or something you enjoyed. And sometimes it becomes an earworm. You can't get it out of your head because it just keeps on playing in your head and you can't turn it off. That is the magic of something like oral traditions, especially when committed to song. And of course, songs, when you write them down, come across a lot of times as poetry. So you begin to understand how and why certain things are written the way they are. Now, the last thing that's quite important is because you can't remember sometimes, the way that you can communicate is by simply the invention of writing. And this is how significant it is. If a person has an idea, say in Egypt, they can transfer that idea to someone who is living in Rome. They write it down, their thoughts. It could be an invention, it could be an idea, it could be anything at all. And once it's on paper, someone can take that piece of paper and they can go and give it to someone else. And those thoughts within that piece of paper can propagate into the other person's mind. Now, today, we have a new form of that. And we sort of just take all our writing for granted. We call it Twitter. Or we might Instagram it. And things become viral. But what do you think they were doing when they were writing things down and passing them to someone else, who then might pass it on to someone else, and a whole bunch of people begin to read it? They are beginning to remember. They are actually, there's a transference of ideas. Now, here's the original forms of writing. This is probably the earliest type of writing, and it's called cuneiform. Pretty simple. You take a little instrument, and you hammer it into, not paper, but into a clay tablet. And the earliest things that archaeologists have found is they're not, this is not like the Bible. Most of the time it's about accounting. Now, why is that important? So anyone who's an aspiring accountant or is an accountant or deals with money, you need to know what this is, because this is super important. Because you might tell someone when you're trading in one city, say New York, and you said, I gave you 3 goats. And then you can go, okay, 3 goats. So we owe you whatever you need for 3 goats. And you would put that on a clay tablet. Well, nowadays you wouldn't. You just wire transfer, stuff like this. But let's say we're there. We're the very earliest time. And what happens is that person will then say, okay, I'm going to issue this clay tablet. And this tablet will say how many goats you gave me. You can then go to Vancouver and exchange this for those 3 goats because you're not dragging them along with you. You've given these to me. And that's how currency actually works. The money in your pocket, whether it's a coin or whether it is a piece of paper, is not worth anything except for what the government or whoever is willing to back it says it's worth. Do you understand what I'm saying? So printing is super important. So this bill in my pocket, let's see what I have. Oh yes, here's $5. Why not? Everything on here, this is just a piece of plastic actually. If you really reduce it down to anything at all, this is a piece of plastic. It's worth no more than any other piece of plastic, maybe less because it's kind of small and thin. But what we do is we imbue it with value because we printed something on it as a promise. And so this is the first kind of writing you'll see here. People are saying this is what something is worth. It was almost like currency. It was like promise. So when we look at this as an economic, practical thing, it then moves on to something more important, which we talked about. And that is, what if someone does not just merely communicate how many goats or cows or, whatever animals you've traded, how much it is in terms of currency, the value, but instead you begin to pass on ideas, like codes of law. And you begin to say, you know what? If this happens, this is the consequence societally. If you jump forward, we talked about perhaps the time of Martin Luther. And one of the things that he said, which was so groundbreaking, was he says, the Pope is wrong. Well, that's a paraphrase. He wrote 97 theses or 95 theses and put them on the door. And someone took that and printed it because the printing press had just been invented. And he printed multiple copies and began to hand out his ideas to people who could read, because not everyone could read. And even in our day, not everyone can read. And those people began to reflect the same things and say, whoa, I think the same thing as this guy. Or, whoa, I've never thought of this before, but now it's in my head. So once you've learned something, you might not necessarily be able to unlearn it. When you hear something, you might not be able to unhear it. You know what I'm saying? And so when you read something, you can't unread it unless you don't understand it. And so literacy is something that our culture and our society often simply takes for granted. You can read the newspaper, you can read all the things that happen online, and not everything that you read is worth reading, as we will find out. So in the early church, this is what happened. Writing had already been invented. But writing was also in a specific class because it was not cheap to put things to paper. Papyrus had a more painstaking way. It's not like we had printing presses, not even run out to Staples and buy yourself a stack of paper. It didn't work like that. You had to have someone who make paper by hand. You had to go and find someone who had the writing implements that you needed. And you're not doing cuneiform, but you'd be able to write if you were literate. And sometimes you had to find someone who was literate. You had to make sure someone was literate. And one of the interesting things about the Jewish culture of Jesus' time was that the children would be taught in the synagogues how to read and write, because they were people who read the Old Testament. And they had to know, although a good number of folks did not know how to read either. Some of them, would not know their Hebrew, and so they would read Greek, which is a more common language. So having understood this, we have the writing of the Gospels. And of course there are the 4, and the reason why that they wrote the Gospels was they wanted to be able to remember the story and the history of Jesus. This person that the apostles knew personally, and had come to believe in his miracles, his work, so that he might or the information about him might continue to be learned and propagated. And so that was why they wrote the Gospels. As people got older, as the witnesses who saw Jesus in history, in time and space, they said, this is not something that should be forgotten. And so what we have are the classic four evangelists. And in this, this is a later development. This is from the Book of Kells, one of the oldest illuminated things from Ireland. And this is a representation called the Tetramorph. And you will see this throughout Christian history as you think and look through it. And what you have is the representation of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each of them have a creature that is identified with these Gospels. Matthew is the man with the wings. Mark is the lion with the wings. And Luke is the ox with the wings. John is the eagle. And these are the representations. When you see them, these are the representations of the evangelists. And what you'll know about this is that these four creatures are taken both from Ezekiel and will also appear in Revelation. These are the representations of the symbology of the Bible, of the Jewish culture, that represents all of creation itself. Because you have humanity, the ruler of all creation, or the steward of creation. You have the lion, which is a representation of all the wild animals. You have the ox, which is a representation of all the domesticated animals. And finally you have the eagle, which is the ruler of all the birds of the air. The sea was a little bit different because it's seen as a region of chaos. So this is within the ordered world. This is how the ancient people thought about things. But each of them also represent a particular trait for those who are believers and for those who are Christians. And so in the human form, you find reason. In the lion, you find courage, because it required courage to be a Christian and to be committed to it. And as the ox, it represents a life of sacrifice. And finally, John, the eagle, that flies above all other things, is a sense of perspective or eternity itself. That you understand eternal life and you put your perspective in these things. And this is a very classic understanding throughout the centuries within Christian development of the four evangelists. And you'll recognize them in other formats as well. So, the same order. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In the center is the Lamb. And then also in stained glass. And you'll know who they are simply by looking at the animals above their heads. You've got, I believe, an eagle. I think that's the ox, the lion, and the man. So you know automatically which is which. So we know this is John, this is Luke, this is Mark, and that's Matthew. And then of course you have more modern interpretations of them as well. And when whichever order they're in, you can see the representation. This is just something for you to know when you visit an art gallery or something, or a church or something. You'll realize that this is a symbology of the Tetramorph. But let me say a little bit more about these characters. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew was one of the disciples. And he, of course, was the tax collector. So he was probably educated at least in accounting of some form, ancient accounting, not our form of accounting. We do it differently these days. But and he would collect the taxes, and he had probably a poor reputation among his people, seen more as a traitor, because he was collecting taxes for the Romans. But Matthew was a follower of Jesus nonetheless, and Matthew was very much steeped in Jewish understanding. So he understands the traditions, and he would explain, or at least connect, the life of Jesus to what was happening in terms of Jewish culture. So you'll find that with Matthew. With Mark, he is not one of the disciples, but he is associated with the disciples. There are, according to possibilities, that he actually traveled with Peter as well as Luke, would have known Paul perhaps. And so he's associated with the apostles. So he probably would have known them, heard their stories, and in this case it's his tradition that is written down. Some would even say that the upper room where Jesus and the disciples had communion, or the Last Supper, was in his house, was in his family's house. But anyways, that is his association. And then, of course, we have Luke. And when you look at Luke, the Gospel of Luke is always attached to Acts of the Apostles. It's just that they're written on two different scrolls. He introduces his Gospel as being written to a fellow named Theophilus. Now, whether Theophilus was actually a Gentile, and it certainly seems like Luke's audience is a Gentile audience, whether he's a real person, or if you read the name Theophilus, it means the friend of God. Theos and Philos. Theophilus, and it could have been a real person, but he's writing both the book of Luke and Acts to explain and gather all the information he can about Jesus. Now, he is not one of the apostles either. He's not one of the 12 disciples. But he is certainly affiliated with them. He traveled with them as well. And his name will pop up in other letters and so on. And so Luke acts, what he tries to do, maybe because of his education as a doctor of his time, a physician of his time, he tried to gather all the information he could about Jesus. And finally, John. John is actually different from the other three. These three are what we call often the synoptic gospels. Synoptic means the same, and optic means, well, vision, right? Like an optometrist. It's like you gave 3 video cameras to, 3 different people, and you sent them to the same events. And then not only did they videotape this thing, you're asking them to edit and put it together into a story. So what happens is that you have 3 different stories, but you have the same events happening. In fact, some are so close together that they are actually almost verbatim, word-for-word accounts. And that illustration is that probably that they may have actually known each other and read each other's material or had the same source material. Whereas John is written later and assumes that you've already read these 3. And he has a more philosophical and mature style in which he assumes a lot of things, but he goes deeper into why. And so you find him more philosophical. And he's probably the opposite of someone like Mark. Mark is very action-oriented, and he's saying, this happened, and this happened, this happened, this happened. That's the way he likes to do it. But they're different personalities, the different forms in which they're written. Now here's the thing. There is the possibility, distinctly, that of course we attribute it to those exact people. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. John being one of the closest disciples to Jesus, which is then significant. But the reality is that it could have been that there are traditions that also looked at these Gospels, their writings or their accounts. And so they're seen as being from their group. The groups that followed Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So there is a sort of conversation ongoing in academia as to whether it was actually written by these people or is from their particular group or tradition. But the reality is that these were established a long time ago in order to communicate what these people had experienced of Jesus himself. So this is what the Gospels are. As we approach it, we understand where they may have come from, the traditions and the people who are directly associated with these Gospels, and the symbology. And so we're going to move through this. But then we get to this question. And I've already answered this, per se. Why write about Jesus? Remember at the beginning of our time here together, I asked you, what did you write last? And not only that, why did you write it? And some of you say you wrote notes because you want to remember something. Some of you said you wrote messages. You're in communication with someone, whether by text or email. Others of you wrote that you wrote something into your journal. Or you wrote notes to yourself to remember something. All of these are part of why we might write a gospel. Or why these people wrote a gospel. To remember. To reflect. To communicate. These are the reasons why the Gospels exist today. And one of the things I wonder, and this is really key, is where would we be today if the Gospels did not exist? Where would we be today if the Gospels did not exist? Another question I have is, why 4 of them? And I think I answered some of that as a possibility in regard to perspective. That you have 4 different perspectives of Jesus, and sometimes of the exact same events that happened, and some of their understandings and interpretations. And allows us today, almost 2,000 years later, to know who Jesus is. But I'm going to put the Gospels into a much larger context as well, into that of the Old Testament. And for that, I'm going to call upon our friends at the Bible Project. So, enjoy this video.
There's this beautiful poem. It's in the book of Isaiah. The city of Jerusalem has just been destroyed by Babylon, a great kingdom in the north. And all of these Jewish people, they've been sent away into exile, but a few remained in the city. And they're left wondering, what just happened? Has our God abandoned us?
Right, because Jerusalem was supposed to be the city where God would reign over the world to bring peace and blessing to everyone.
Now, Isaiah had been saying that Jerusalem's destruction was a mess of Israel's own making. They had turned away from their God, become corrupt, and so their city and their temple were destroyed.
Yeah, everything seems lost.
But the poem goes on. There's a watchman on the city walls. And far out on the hills we see a messenger, and he's running towards the city. He's running and he's shouting, "Good news!" And Isaiah says, "How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news."
Beautiful feet?
Yes. The feet are beautiful because they're carrying a beautiful message.
What's the message?
That despite Jerusalem's destruction, Israel's God still reigns as king, and that God himself is going to one day return to this city, take up his throne, and bring peace.
And the watchmen sing for joy because of the good news that their God still reigns.
Now in the New Testament, we find this same phrase, the good news. It's the Greek word euangelion, and it's also sometimes translated with the word gospel.
And so when Christians say, "Do you believe the gospel?" they mean, "Do you believe the news?"
But not just any news. In the Bible, this phrase is always about the announcement of the reign of a new king. And in the New Testament, the Gospels use this phrase to summarize all of Jesus' teachings. They say that he went about proclaiming the good news of God's kingdom.
So Jesus saw himself as the messenger, bringing the news that God reigns.
Yes, but the way that he described God's reign, it surprised everybody. I mean, think, a powerful, successful kingdom. It needs to be strong, able to defeat its enemies. But Jesus said the greatest person in God's kingdom was the weakest, the one who loves and who serves the poor. And he said that you live under God's reign when you respond to evil by loving your enemies and forgiving them and seeking peace. This is an upside-down kingdom.
Now, Jesus also said that his kingdom was arriving with him.
Yeah, so for example, there's this really interesting story where there's a high-ranking Roman officer, and he comes to Jesus begging him to heal his servant. And he even calls Jesus his Lord, acknowledging that Jesus is his authority. Jesus praises this man for recognizing what no one else yet had, that not only was Jesus announcing God's kingdom, he was a king.
And so the word gets out that this Jewish man from Galilee is talking and acting like he's the king of Israel. He's appointing 12 disciples, which are an image of Israel's 12 tribes. He's healing people, forgiving people their sins.
And all of this so threatened Israel's leaders that they finally decide to have him on. And Jesus let them.
Yeah, which is a weird thing to do if you're trying to become king.
That's right. But for Jesus, this is what had to happen. Jesus saw the sin and the devastation of his people Israel as just one small part of the entire human condition. How all humanity has rebelled against God, resulting in the tragedy and devastation of our whole world. So how is God going to bring his reign over such a world? Jesus believed it would be through an act of sacrificial love for his enemies. This is why in the Gospels, Jesus' crucifixion is depicted as his enthronement as the King of the Jews.
Yeah, he receives a crown. He also receives a robe.
He's exalted up, not onto a throne, but onto the cross.
How beautiful are the feet that bring good news.
And the good news now is that Jesus has defeated death and that he reigns as king. That he's dealt with our sin and corruption himself and that he's conquered it with his life and with his love.
And then Jesus sends his followers to go out and keep announcing this good news of the upside-down kingdom.
And to invite everyone to give their allegiance to him, the king who defeated death with his love.
Why preach the gospel, or why write about Jesus? This is the answer. That it is about the good news of the kingdom of God, not just for the time of Israel, but for each and every one of us. When we gather here on Sundays, and then all the Christians around the world gather together, whether it's on Sundays or other times of the week, we gather in the name of Jesus, who is our Lord and who is our Savior. And so when we read the Gospels, it is about reading about the one who we have allegiance to if we are believers. It reminds us of who Jesus is. It is actually, when someone asks, what part of the Bible should I read first? Well, there's a lot of places you can read. There are 66 books, if you're just counting the Protestant canon. But the part that they should read the most, and that we as believers should read the most, are the Gospels. There are things that we can do. For example, my theology, just to give you a peek under the hood, is not actually based primarily on the writings of Paul. It's not built on the Psalms. My code of ethics, my theology, my understanding of God comes primarily from the Gospels. I do not ask, what does Paul think or John think? I ask, what did Jesus do? And sometimes I will have 4 different perspectives on the exact same thing. And they resonate together. And this does not mean I ignore the rest of Scripture by any means. No. But they become supplemental to the Gospels themselves. When Pastor Diana was ordained last year, and I mentioned this, I gave her a Bible. And one of the things that I say as the ordaining minister, as I say, read this book and love it, not for its own sake, but because of whom it speaks. It speaks of the one you follow, that you love, and that you obey. And that is why the Gospels exist. That's why they're written. Not just for ourselves, but all the generations before us, the centuries that have gone before, and the centuries yet to come. As we look at the little ones here, that gospel will pass to them from us as a community. So one of the things that I also want to remind you of as we move into the rest of this, I'm going to ask you to do something very simple. And I want to invite you to begin to write a gospel. The gospel according to Ray, or Dave, or Andrea, or Elam, or Jaden, And what does that mean? Does that mean we're going to splice that and we're going to stick it in the Bible and ask them to publish it? No, that's not what it means. I think these quotes will help us a little bit more. Rodney Smith says there are 5 Gospels. Okay, this is not heresy. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Christian. Most people will never read the first 4. Especially in our culture. We are the Bible. Our unbelieving family and friends are reading. The beauty of the Gospel writers is this. They are far from perfect. You have to love that about them. We get to hear about Peter a fair bit. Because Peter is the one who opposes Jesus returning to Jerusalem, knowing that he's going to die and face opposition. And Jesus turns to him and says, "Get behind me, Satan." So he gets a bit of a shake. But he's just so human. When the soldiers come or the temple guards come to take Jesus away from the Garden of Gethsemane, he's the one who pulls the sword and chops off someone's ear. I guess he needed to practice a little better. But Jesus healed that person. So he's impetuous. You can see his character very clearly. But there's others, like John, who is more thoughtful, more quiet, who is connected. And you see that he's actually even in the house of the high priest. For some reason, they know who he is. And his family is connected, and he's able to be present. Whereas Peter's working out in the courtyard. They didn't let him in. So when you read the Gospels, you begin to discover these people who then who tell their stories to others. Or Thomas, although he did not write a Gospel, there is a Gnostic, a false Gospel written in his name. But he's the one who doubts that Jesus was resurrected from the dead when the other disciples tell him, because he wasn't there when Jesus appears. But he's the one who ends up bringing the Gospel to India. And today there are entire regions or towns in India that are completely Christian in their culture because of someone like him. But you also, in your imperfections, it's because of the grace of God and your continued transformation as a follower of Christ, you too carry within you the gospel. I would go as far as to say that you are an incarnation, each of us are an incarnation of the gospel, if we truly follow Christ. And our stories are not ever over. Even if we're in difficult places or dark places, it's the forgiveness that we experience. It's the grace, because we are not the heroes. We never are the heroes of the gospel. We are those who receive it. And so I would like to invite you to consider writing a gospel, even this morning, and to share it with each other. So what I'm going to ask you to do at this time is I'm going to hand out these pieces of paper, and I want to ask you to do two things. You're going to break into groups, but we'll do this kind of as groups, but as individuals as well. As I want to ask you to share with each other, how did you come to know Jesus? Now, whether you're a Christian or not, how do you understand Him? Or how have you come to know Him? Because, of course, the journey continues to go forward, right? Just because we know something about Him doesn't mean we know everything about Him. But how were we introduced to Him? And the second question is the one I want you to write down. The answer to the second question. You don't have to write a lot. There is probably a lot, because it's probably not just one simple story. But just tell me one thing. Who is Jesus to you? And you can answer that question in whatever way you like. I want to invite you to write it down for two reasons. You might write it down twice. So you might want to take two pieces of it. One is for yourself. We write a journal, we reflect on it. And when you write it, if you're going to keep it for yourself, I want you to keep it throughout the week and look at it again. To remind yourself who Jesus is to you. And I do invite you to take 2 pieces, because on the second one, write the same thing, because it's also meant to be shared if you're comfortable. So you can make it more generic if you like. And what we'll do is we're going to collect that second piece of paper, the same thing you've written, who Jesus is to you. It's completely anonymous. And I'd like to read that to us. So you can write as little as you like, as much as you like. Whoever Jesus is to you, whatever He's done for you. You might want to tell a story. It can be anything. I invite you to do that. So without further ado, I'm going to ask to hand these out. So take 2 or more if you like, depending on how much paper you need. And I also have some pens. If you have your own pen, that's fantastic. If you don't, that's fine too. We'll just pass these around and make sure you get one. So we're going to spend the rest of our time, get this, writing a gospel. It is good news. But I also want you to begin to think about embodying it in the way that you live every day. So let's spend some time doing that. So the first thing we're going to do is gather up into groups, maybe 4 or 5 people. That'd be great. So we might have enough for 4 groups, maybe 5 in this room. And then what we're going to do is, first of all, share this. How did you come to know Jesus? And I'll let you know when it's time to switch over to that writing portion, and then if you'd like to tell that story. All right? Any questions? We're pretty good? Yes? So gather up into groups. That's the main thing right now I invite you to do. 4 or 5 people or so would be about right. It's okay if you have 6. I'm not going to get angry. But it'd be good if you had more, maybe 4 as a minimum. So there's a group over there of 3, so